If there was a president who was more bipartisan, there really weren't many of them. Eisenhower was one of them. Clearly, Reagan was one of them with his relationship with Tip O'Neill. But George H.W. Bush was one of them as well, and really wanted to reach across the aisle in numerous ways, but especially when he launched the invasion of Iraq to take down Saddam Hussein and to really liberate the Kuwaitis. Didn't end up taking down Saddam Hussein in that effort, and was criticized at some point for not going further at that point. But the reason he didn't is because he didn't have the coalition's backing at that point. He actually, for launching the war to liberate Kuwait, had the biggest international coalition of any president that has ever assembled a coalition. One of the things about George H.W. Bush is that he always reached out across the aisle. He established a really strong relationship with Bill Clinton. In their afterlife, as you've talked about before, they had, after the presidency, a life of raising money for charity, one in which they established a very close relationship. But President H.W. Bush will go down as somebody who was one of these presidents who was not tremendously ideological. He was about getting stuff done. And I think history, John Meacham wrote a large book about President Bush's life. And I think you look at that and the span of all the things that happened, there will be a lot of things remembered under 1924 to 2018.
Yeah, and enormous foreign policy achievements that when people really look back at his accomplishments as president and coming through the Reagan years as vice president as well, I mean, those are notable. But so many things domestically, too, that he had a hand in making sure happened. He signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that was a landmark piece of legislation. As somebody who used to practice labor and employment law, I handled many cases under the ADA, and how important it was to make a way for people to have a place in the workplace and in society, despite any physical challenge that they may have. So there's a lot that happened domestically as well, even though he had just one term as the head of the White House, Bret, as commander-in-chief.
Yeah, think how challenging that was, though, as I'm standing here in the Reagan Presidential Library, for a vice president to follow one of the most popular presidents in President Reagan. Obviously, in his second term, President Reagan's approval ratings went down a bit. But here is a vice president who steps into the role of someone who's taking over for this larger-than-life figure. Now, President Reagan fought communism more than any other president, perhaps. The Berlin Wall goes down under George H.W. Bush. It happens, and I researched this and wrote about it, and at the time, Brent Scowcroft and Marlin Fitzwater, his press secretary, run into the Oval Office and say, "Do you want to make a statement?" And George H.W. Bush says, "No, I don't." And they say, "Why? You have to make a statement. It's happening. It's happening live." And he says, "I really don't want to dance on the top of the Berlin Wall coming down. I want to establish my own relationship with Mikhail Gorbachev. I want to establish it in a way that respects him and doesn't tap dance on this moment." And I think that moment, more than any other, when the Berlin Wall comes down and George H.W. Bush does not take that moment to say, "See, we won," says more about the man and how he dealt with things than many other things.
Yeah, and if you, and I know that you, I'm sure undoubtedly have had the chance, but others out there watching, if you have a chance to go to his presidential library, they're always such interesting places, no matter whom the president was. But when you walk through there and you read about his Navy service and the story about him being shot down, you talk through and walk through each chapter of his life. It is so varied, and we think about lighthearted moments with him, too. I mean, we know he didn't like broccoli. You know, he loved his crazy socks. I mean, he was quite a character, aside from being a very serious policy wonk and getting serious things done. We know that he, was awarded numerous medals during his Navy service, and then the Medal of Freedom by President Obama. But as we keep going back to this theme of how important family was to him, we think about the summer just a few weeks ago, one of his granddaughters, Barbara Bush, got married and took that wedding to Kennebunkport and said that it was so important that they wanted him to be a part of it. She'd lost her grandmother, obviously, earlier in the year, and the family really wanted to be together and celebrate that together. And they're rejoicing that they had those moments together to celebrate another happy time before he headed back to Texas, where, as we talked about earlier, his spokesman said he was looking forward to getting back to Texas because he wanted some good Tex-Mex down there. He was a character.
He was a total character. And family was so important, Shannon, to President Bush. You know, I had the privilege of being invited to a golf tournament out in Maine at Kennebunkport and played alongside with a bunch of different people with President George W. Bush. And at one point, President George H.W. Bush arrived, and he was in a golf cart with Barbara Bush at that time. And you just saw the love between the two of them, even at that advanced stage where they were just caring for each other. It was actually the same day in that obit piece where the eclipse happened, and they had that picture with the sunglasses that you see. I think what was most striking to me was to read back about the love letters and the exchanges between President Bush and Barbara Bush, and then that stark image at Barbara Bush's funeral in April where he is sitting there in a wheelchair with Doro Bush behind him, and then the casket in front of them in that church. And there it is, that moment where he is saying goodbye to the love of his life. And I think Barbara Bush's funeral actually was a cathartic moment for the country, in which you saw people of both sides reacting to this family that had really changed the country's life. And I think you're going to see that over the next couple of days and perhaps the next week as the country says goodbye to the 41st President of the United States. And there will be a lot of people from both sides who have a lot of things to say about this president.